The baby wasn't breathing, or at least it didn't sound like breathing. It was too faint, a flutter of something that vanished before he could even hear it twice. Matthew knelt by the box, shoving aside the half-frozen sackcloth cover, his hands shaking, not from the cold, but from the terror that had bloomed in his chest for the past 30 minutes. "Come on," he whispered, then louder. "Come on now. Stay with me. Just stay." No answer, just the slow creak of the wind outside, dragging itself across the boards of the cabin like an old man's breath. Matthew's wife, Laura, was asleep, or unconscious, in the corner bed, bundled under every spare coat and hide they had. Her face was hollow from the childbirth just hours before, cheeks sunken, skin pale. The fire had gone out, the last of the wood had been burned before dawn, and the sun hadn't risen since. No light came through the shuttered cracks anymore. Only wind and snow and silence. He hovered over the box again, reaching into the hay-packed crate he had stuffed tight the night before. Stuffed like a fool, they'd said. The boys in town had mocked him. His neighbor Hank had outright laughed. "That ain't no baby cradle, that's a damn feed bin," Hank had said, grinning through his tobacco-stained teeth. "You fixin' to raise a piglet in there or what?" He could still hear the laughter, but now the firewood was gone, the stove cold, the room colder, and only that hay box, insulated with straw, lined with burlap and blankets, warmed last night by coals and body heat, stood between his newborn daughter and the grave. He pressed a hand gently into the hay, feeling past the warm layers for the soft curve of her body. Then he heard it again, a gasp, shallow, small, but there, alive, his chest seized. He nearly wept. She was still alive, but barely. He had no fire, no light, nothing left to burn but the wooden spoon, the legs of a stool, maybe the underside of the bed. He glanced around, eyes wild. He could tear down the shelves, rip apart the old floorboards. But how much time would that buy? An hour? 2? Outside, it was still snowing, thick, relentless, the kind of snow that buries cabins in drifts and strangles men in their sleep. The wind screamed again, higher this time. The door groaned. He had wedged it shut with a stump, but snow had found its way through the seams. He sat down hard on the dirt floor, drawing his knees to his chest, staring at the little box. If that hay hadn't worked, she'd already be dead. They hadn't planned to have the baby here, this far up the mountain, this far from help. But Laura's water had broken 5 days early, 3 days into the storm, and by the time Matthew realized what was happening, it was too late to get down the pass. They were trapped. He had delivered the baby himself, with shaking hands, under a dying lantern, in a cabin nearly as cold as the outside, and he hadn't known if she'd make it. Neither of them, really. The storm was supposed to be a flurry. That's what old Harmon at the trading post said. "Quick dusting," he'd muttered. "Maybe a foot, 2 at most. Be gone by Sunday." But it hadn't. It had come down for 4 straight days and nights, thick as paste, choking the passes, clogging every trail. The whole valley had vanished beneath white, and now it was Saturday. No one had come. No one would. He had already used up all the firewood, rationed the last logs with care, just as his father taught him, even fed the stove with dry kindling and leftover furniture. But it wasn't enough. It never was in a freeze like this. Every knot of pine he fed the flames only gave him an hour. 2 if he got lucky. That hay-packed box, though, that had lasted the whole night. He had built it 2 weeks ago after finding a book Laura's mother had given them, a tattered little pamphlet full of old German homemaking advice. One page had an illustration of a strohwiege, a straw cradle used by peasants in Bavaria, stuffed with hay, designed to trap heat from nearby stones or body warmth. He had laughed at first, but he was desperate, and when he showed it to Hank, the laughter in the saloon that night had nearly shaken the walls. But Laura believed him. "Let them laugh," she had said, clutching her belly. "I trust you." And now it was the only thing keeping their daughter alive. Matthew stood and walked to the corner of the cabin, digging through the cupboard. Nothing, not even flour. They had eaten boiled leather 2 nights ago. The last potato was gone. He could feel hunger chewing at the walls of his own stomach, a dull, gnawing pressure that wouldn't stop. He stepped outside into the blizzard, instantly slapped in the face by wind so cold it burned. The air felt like knives. Snow whipped sideways through the pine trees, burying the path he'd dug just hours earlier. The sky was gray, flat, hopeless, and somewhere beneath the frozen silence, he heard the distant creak of the forest groaning under its own weight. There was no more firewood, but there was something. He trudged around the side of the cabin, pulling a tarp off the snow-covered pile he'd once scoffed at. The old manure haystack he'd meant to compost come spring. Half of it had frozen solid, but the inner core was dry, packed tight. He clawed into it with his bare hands, pulled out armfuls, dragged them inside. He wasn't going to burn it. He was going to build it, build another warmer, bigger, stronger, with layers. A hay oven, his mind whispered. An oven made of straw, not for cooking, but for surviving. He grabbed the baby box and pressed it deeper into the hay, wrapping it tighter, layering more around the sides, forming a second wall. Then he placed a small pot of near-frozen water beside it, the same way they used to heat a barrel bath with a brick. The heat from the water would radiate into the straw. Maybe it would do something. Maybe it would save her. He crawled in beside the box, wrapping his arms around the mound, pressing his chest into the straw, holding his daughter through the hay. His breath fogged the air. His eyes closed. He stayed like that for hours. He didn't know he'd fallen asleep until the crash of snow from the rooftop jolted him awake. It was morning, or at least lighter. The storm had thinned. Pale daylight slipped through the shutters. He lunged toward the box, heart thudding, a cry, weak but louder than yesterday. The baby was alive. Her skin was warm, and Laura from the bed was staring at him with wide, wet eyes. "You did it," she whispered. He didn't answer. He just dropped to his knees and wept. But they weren't out of danger yet. Laura couldn't walk. The baby needed warmth. And the storm wasn't done with them. Food was gone. The chimney was clogged with ice. And no one was coming. They had to find a way to last. 3 more days at least, maybe more. And there was only one thing left that could do it. Hay, and hope. The only thing colder than the outside now was the realization that they weren't going to be found. Not in time. The valley lay entombed under 4 feet of snow. And even if the storm eased, the mountain pass was a week's hard ride for a man in full health. And Matthew wasn't in full health. He could feel it in his lungs. The sharpness, the drag. In his fingers, the slow, numb creep that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with circulation. And in his heart, tight, nervous, beating too hard for a man who had eaten nothing in 2 days. But the baby was still alive, and that mattered more than anything. He checked the cradle again. The straw around it was warm to the touch, slightly damp now from sweat and condensation. But the baby girl, swaddled tightly and sunk into the innermost layer, slept still, a gentle rise and fall barely visible under the folds of fabric. That box had become more than a warmer. It was a lifeboat in an ocean of cold. Laura lay still under the piled hides and coats, her cheeks pinker than the day before. That scared him too. Pinkness could mean health or fever. She hadn't stood since the delivery, and though she hadn't bled out, a miracle in itself, she was weak, bone-deep weak. He had no milk to give her. No broth, nothing. She needed calories. The baby would need milk soon, and he was out of time. He sat at the table, staring at the battered tin plate. The fork lay beside it like a cruel joke, as if it had purpose. He picked it up. It was heavier than he remembered. Then again, everything was heavier now. He looked down at his boots, rawhide. He stared a long time. Then he took out his knife. By midday, the cabin smelled of boiled leather. It didn't make broth, more like a bitter gelatin, but it was hot, and that was all that mattered. He spooned it to Laura's lips slowly, letting the warmth linger. She took it without complaint. Her eyes fluttered open again. "You're still here," she murmured. "I ain't going nowhere," he said. She tried to smile, failed, but her hand reached out and found his. He wrapped both arms around her, just for a minute, just to feel someone's skin. Then the baby whimpered. The box was still warm, but he needed to reinforce it again. The outer hay was flattening, and every hour without heat outside the straw cradle was an hour closer to disaster. He pulled the last sacks of hay from the back. Not the good hay, not the dry, golden, sweet-smelling pile they'd used to insulate the box. No, this was frost-bitten, coarse, nearly manure-stained hay left from the goat pen when they'd still had goats. But it was insulation, and insulation was life. He broke up the flakes, layered them around the second box he had started building. A bigger frame, closer to a hay oven than a cradle now, a squat, coffin-like rectangle with room for a bedpan of warm water and stones, and enough mass to trap his own body heat when he curled around it like a mother wolf. He packed the outer layers tighter this time, crisscrossing the straw with thin planks from the floorboards, building a chamber, a cocoon, something survivable. And when it was done, he moved the baby from the smaller crate into it. It wasn't elegant, but it was something. Then carefully, he did something desperate. He lit a match. The last 3 matches in the tin box were a promise he'd made to himself not to break. 3 matches, he'd told himself, were for emergency signal fires only, if a rider passed by, or if they ever made it to the ridge and needed to flag help. But now, survival wasn't about signaling anyone. It was about making it to tomorrow. He struck it. The flame flared. He lit a twist of dry pine bark he'd found tucked behind the chimney, a forgotten shaving from the last wood-cutting day. Then he pressed the burning twist into the bed of stones beside the water pot and the hay box. Just a minute of flame, enough to warm the nearby stone. The fire hissed and smoked. It caught the edge of the straw, but only a curl, and Matthew stamped it out before it spread. Then silence, then warmth. The baby didn't stir. The heat lingered. Not much, but enough. Matthew collapsed beside the oven, curled tight, and let himself drift. Not sleep, just drift. The next day brought no sun, but the wind died. The sky, though grey, no longer howled. The world outside was a white silence, thick and endless. Matthew woke with a start. The baby was whimpering. That was good. Weak, but steady. Laura coughed behind him. He turned. She was sitting up. "How long?" she asked. Voice hoarse. "Day and a half, maybe," he said. Storms led up. She nodded slowly. Then her eyes met his. "We have to leave soon." He knew it, but hearing her say it broke him a little. "I can't leave you here," he said. "You won't. But we can't stay either. The hay won't hold forever." "No," he agreed. They both looked at the box, the hay-piled oven cradling their daughter, her little breath fogging the edge of the burlap. Alive. "We carry her in that," Laura said. "Wrap it tight. I hold her. You pull me on the sled. It's 5 miles to the Miller place. Then we go 5 miles. He didn't argue. But 5 miles in snow that deep was like 50, and the sled was buried under a drift taller than a man. He went out to find it. It took half the day just to reach the shed. The roof had collapsed. The drift around the sled was so solid he had to cut it out like a trench. Every shovel load of snow felt like lifting bricks. His breath steamed the air. His chest burned. When he finally dug the sled free, it was cracked on one runner, but he could patch it. He pulled it to the cabin, tied down the runner with lengths of soaked rawhide, reinforced it with part of the doorframe. He packed the bottom with hay, built a cradle inside it, then padded that with more hay. Every inch of insulation mattered now. By nightfall, he had a makeshift travel warmer, half sled, half oven, all hope. And just as he finished, he noticed something on the ridge, smoke. It was a thread of black rising against the pale grey sky, thin, almost gone, but there. He climbed the hill behind the cabin, lungs screaming, boots barely gripping the snow. From the top, he could see it, the Miller cabin, 4 miles southeast, still standing. The chimney smoked. They were alive. He whooped. The sound cracked in his throat, but it echoed. It echoed. He ran back down the hill, stumbled into the cabin, breathless. "We've got a chance." Laura didn't ask. She knew the look on his face. She rose to her feet for the first time, trembling. Matthew wrapped her in every hide they had. Then gently, they lifted the baby into the hay oven on the sled. He hitched himself to the sled with rope. No horse, no ox, just him. Then he began to walk. Every step was hell. The snow was too deep to walk clean. Each movement meant carving a trench with his legs, hauling the sled behind him through powder and packed ice alike. The sled bumped, dragged, caught on roots, skidded across frozen brush. He braced it with a stick he held in one hand, guiding it like a plow. Behind him, Laura clutched the baby in the hay oven, her hands shaking inside the coats. She didn't complain. She never once cried out. By the second mile, his legs were bleeding, his throat raw. By the third, the wind picked up again. He almost gave in, almost, but then he heard it, a dog barking. He collapsed just outside the Miller fence. When he woke, he was inside a warm room. Light flickered on the log walls. His cheeks were burning. Someone was rubbing warmth into his arms. "Stay still," a voice said. "Laura," he croaked. "The baby, safe," came another voice. "She's safe. Both of them. Your little girl's crying good and strong." He wept again. Later he saw the box, the hay oven, still intact, still warm, and the men gathered around it, shaking their heads. "You did this with hay?" someone asked. Matthew didn't answer. He just closed his eyes. The Miller cabin was full of smoke, sweat, and disbelief. They couldn't stop staring at it, that box of hay and cloth and patchworked planks still holding the baby warm, like some backwoods miracle. The coals they'd placed in the iron kettle beside it had barely cooled. The straw hadn't caught fire. The baby hadn't frozen. The mother hadn't lost consciousness on the ride over. She should have died, the old matron muttered under her breath again. "I've seen strong boys freeze tighter in fence posts in less weather than that." And still the child lived. Still she suckled. Still her breath came in that tiny, precious rise and fall, surrounded by a shell of hay, an ingenuity no one in that room had ever seen before. Matthew didn't hear most of it. He was drifting in and out, half awake, throat so raw it felt like he'd swallowed coals. Every muscle in his legs had locked tight. His back spasmed if he moved wrong. He'd pulled the sled 4 miles through drift and ice with a starving body and fever coming on. But he didn't care, because the baby was warm. Laura was wrapped in quilts beside him on a cot. They'd given her soup. She drank it slowly, wordless. The look on her face wasn't relief exactly. It was something heavier, gratitude too deep to speak, and exhaustion too heavy to lift. They had survived, but they weren't the only ones who needed saving. Word traveled fast in snow country. By the next afternoon, men from the ridge settlement had arrived, then a rider from down the valley, then a pair of neighbors from the other side of the frozen creek. One of them, Hank Blanton, still wore that same felt hat as always, but not the grin, not anymore. He stood in the corner near the fire, arms crossed, jaw tight. "You really rode it out up there," he said at last. Matthew didn't answer. "Built a baby oven out of hay." Hank shook his head. "I'll be damned. You laughed at him for it," Laura said softly from the cot. Hank winced. "I did." Matthew raised his head slowly. "Still think it was foolish?" "No," Hank said. "No, I reckon I don't." And that would have been enough. But it wasn't just about proving someone wrong anymore. Something had shifted. The men in that room weren't just curious. They were listening, closely. "How'd you build it exactly?" one asked. "The thing. The warmer?" Matthew's voice was a rasp, but he nodded. "I used the feed crate first. Then I lined it with old blankets, packed straw tight between the layers, sealed the gaps with wet burlap, let it dry hard, made a chamber inside for heat. Heat from what? Body at first, then stones, then warm water in a sealed pot. Held the heat longer than I thought it would. Hay traps it if you build it right, like a box of air. Did it catch? Not if you keep the coals outside the straw, but close, damp layer between. The key's not lighting anything inside it, just warm nearby." They kept asking, kept writing it down. By sundown, 2 of the neighbors were cutting planks for their own makeshift cradles. "It's not just for babies," one of them said. "Could be for anything. A cow calf, a sick dog. Hell, even for a man half froze." Matthew didn't say it, but he'd thought the same. He'd felt the warmth of the box through his clothes those nights, how it radiated out like a small sun, how he'd curled around it not just for her, but for himself. Hay, the most overlooked thing on any homestead. You feed the horse with it, line the stall, mulch the garden, but you never think of it as heat. But now they were, all of them. By the end of that week, 7 cabins across the valley had built straw ovens. They weren't elegant, they weren't pretty, but they worked. The first saved a dying cow. The second kept a fevered child warm when the chimney collapsed. The third helped keep a cache of food from freezing solid during a second cold snap. By mid-February, they were calling them Matthew boxes. He hated the name, told them to call them whatever they liked, but the name stuck anyway. And one morning, while splitting kindling for the miller's stove, Matthew heard the thing he never expected. "They're sending someone up from Helena." He looked up. It was Clarence Grady, the schoolteacher. Round-shouldered, sharp-eyed, always with ink on his cuffs. "Sending who?" Matthew asked. "Some fella from the Agricultural Bureau. Wants to see the device." "It's not a device, it's just straw and wood." "That's the point," Clarence said. "You did something clever with nothing. That's what folks want to learn about." Matthew rubbed the back of his neck. "I didn't invent it. Read about it in a book. Doesn't matter. You made it real. In America. In a storm. With a baby that should have died. That's a story." And so it became one. The man from Helena came in early March, just as the last snow was melting off the lower ridge. He wore a city coat, had clean gloves, and carried a satchel full of paper. They brought him to the miller's barn, where Matthew had rebuilt a larger version of the warmer. This one big enough for a person to crawl into entirely. He'd insulated it with pine needles, straw, and even animal hair, then wrapped it in a stitched canvas cover, tied tight with old rope. The agent took notes, photographed it with a box camera. "Low fuel solutions," he muttered. "Could be a real help for settlers out west, homesteaders, or rail crews stranded in snow." "It ain't fire," Matthew said. "It's heat retention, just a way to stretch what you got." The man nodded. "That's the most American thing I've ever heard." He left with his notes. Promised to write something up. Matthew forgot about it until the letter came. They'd printed it in the Helena Gazette, then the Bozeman Chronicle, then something called the Pioneer's Digest. "A hay warmer that saved a life," the headline read. Below it a sketch of the box, crude but clear, and under that, his name, full, first and last. He sat on the porch of the miller's cabin, holding the paper in his hands, staring at it like it might catch fire. "You all right?" Laura asked from behind him. She was walking better now, stronger. "I didn't want this," he said. "I know. I just wanted to keep her alive." "I know that too." She sat beside him, took the paper, folded it, set it on her lap. "You did something good. That doesn't mean the world has to ignore it." He said nothing. The baby fussed in her arms. She rocked gently. And then, for the first time in days, Matthew smiled. A small, tired, honest smile. That spring, they moved back to their own cabin. It had survived barely. The roof had caved in near the stove, and the pantry was full of rot, but it still stood. Matthew repaired it board by board, took down the old chimney, dug a trench around the south wall to drain the meltwater, rebuilt the stove with bricks brought up from town. But one thing he didn't change was the box. He kept it, the hay-packed oven, cleaned it, mended the lining, restuffed the sides, moved it into the corner of the cabin like a relic. They used it that first spring for a lamb born too early, then for a neighbor's boy who fell into the creek and needed warming fast. Then again when Laura caught a fever that left her chilled to the bone. It became more than a tool. It became a tradition. One evening, weeks after the thaw, Hank rode up the trail. He had a small crate in his arms. "What's this?" Matthew asked. "Thought you'd want to see it." Hank set it down. It was a wooden frame, lined with straw, burlap stitched tight, plank planks notched clean. Matthew tilted his head. You made one. Made 3, Hank said. Gave one to my brother. Other ones in the barn. Matthew lifted the lid. Inside, the finish was smoother, the joints neater. Built it better than I did. Learned from yours. You did the hard part. I just cleaned it up. Matthew didn't know what to say. Hank cleared his throat. Town wants to build a batch of 'em. Store 'em in the church attic for hard winters. Thought you might help. I don't need my name on 'em. Didn't say we'd put it. Matthew grinned. Then maybe I will. Hank smiled too. For once, without smugness, they shook hands. Winter came again that year, not as harsh, but cold enough. And when the snow came down heavy in early January, 3 families used their warmers, one for a new calf, one for a sick grandmother, one for a set of twin boys born too soon. None of them froze, not one. And that cabin on the ridge, Matthew's cabin, became the place people whispered about when the weather turned cruel. The cabin where the hay saved the child, where firewood ran out and something else kept them alive. People stopped laughing about straw. They started storing it with care. They started building things with it. And somewhere, tucked in the quiet of those long nights, a tiny child slept warm in a box of hay, while the wind howled harmlessly outside. By the time their daughter took her first steps across the floorboards of the rebuilt cabin, the hay warmer had already saved 7 lives. Not just human ones, though that would have been reason enough. There'd been the baby twins born during the March thaw, the school teacher's elderly father, the trapper's nephew who fell into the river ice. But animals too, a calf born breech in mid-blizzard, a mule with a split hoof laid up for days, a runt litter of pups whose mother died after a snake bite. Lives that otherwise would have slipped silently into the ground, tucked beneath snow or behind frost-covered windows, but not anymore, because of a box of straw, because of desperation, because Matthew did something everyone else laughed at, until the day it worked. And even now, with the baby now toddling, bright-eyed and strong, even now with the warm months coming, and the trees waking up again, that box still sat in the cabin corner, cleaned and trimmed and patched from the wear, not out of sentiment, not even pride, just readiness, because winter always comes back, and next time, he wouldn't wait to be laughed at. He'd already know what to build. In April, a letter arrived, one with an actual seal. It was from the Helena Bureau again, this time written by someone higher up, someone in D.C. or maybe Salt Lake. The language was stilted, polite, full of terms like low-resource heat retention design and agricultural application in isolated frontier environments. But tucked between the bureaucratic phrasing was a simple question. Would he come teach? Matthew blinked at the words. Teach. They were hosting a demonstration at the territorial fair that summer. Homesteading inventions, backwoods solutions, frontier devices. And the bureau wanted him, Matthew Porter, the man who slept beside a haybox, to show folks how he'd built it. He showed the letter to Laura. She laughed warm and quiet and proud. I don't know what I'd say, he admitted. Say what you did, she replied. Say how it worked. That's not much. It saved a life. He looked over at the cradle, the newer one, the one with polished sides and proper handles, designed just the same but prettier, the one others had started calling the Porter box. Maybe that's enough, he said. The fairgrounds outside Helena weren't what he expected. He'd only been to the city once before, and never during an event like this. There were tents as far as he could see, men shouting about plows and seed drills, women gathered around spinning machines and cider presses. But the booth they gave him was simple, a table, a little raised platform, and a canvas sign that read, Frontier Insulation, Surviving with Straw, a demonstration by Matthew Porter. He stood there awkwardly for an hour. Then 2 people walked by, stopped, asked polite questions. Most wanted to know if it was for cattle. Some laughed, not mean, just curious. You really slept in this thing? One man asked, poking the straw lining. I did, Matthew said. And it didn't burn down? Nope. What about mold? What about rats? If you do it right, it don't mold, and rats'll avoid it if you keep it warm. But how hot does it get? Hot enough to keep a baby alive in -20 degrees with no firewood? That made the man pause. He didn't ask anything else. Word spread. By the end of the second day, his booth had a small crowd around it. Farmers, widows, young couples, a group of nuns. They all listened. He showed them how to stack the hay, how to layer it, how to build an interior chamber, how to avoid moisture trapping. He told them what he'd learned the hard way, that it wasn't about burning hotter, but holding on longer, that when you're miles from help, heat isn't just comfort, it's time, time to survive, time for help to arrive, time to not die. And when he said that, they listened even closer. That night in the boarding room outside town, Matthew sat by the window and stared out at the twilight. It felt strange, having people ask him how to survive, as if he was someone wise. But he didn't feel wise. He felt lucky. He heard a knock at the door. It was Clarence Grady, the school teacher, carrying a small leather notebook and an envelope. "They want to publish your diagrams," Clarence said. "The ones from the fair. A booklet, maybe." Matthew chuckled dryly. "What for?" "For folks who haven't had to freeze yet. For those who might. For the next man who runs out of firewood at the edge of nowhere." Matthew nodded slowly. "All right." Clarence handed him the envelope. "And this is from a newspaper fella who wants to write it up in the dispatch." Matthew winced. "Lord, not again." "It's good, Matt, I promise. You said no the first few times, but maybe it's time to say yes." "Why?" Clarence looked at him. "Because one day some father's going to be holding a newborn in a storm, and he's going to remember this story. And if he remembers it in time, his child lives. That's why." The article ran the next week. This time it was shorter, cleaner, no sketches, just a photo of Matthew holding the straw box beside a stove, one hand on the lid, the other on his knee. The headline read, "The man who warmed a baby with hay," and that's when it started. Letters came. Not many, but enough. One from Wyoming Territory, one from the Dakotas, another from Oregon. People asking for plans, asking how to make one, asking if it really worked. He wrote them back, all of them, sometimes just a paragraph, sometimes a whole page. He drew diagrams when he had to, wrote down every lesson he learned during that week of snow and desperation. He didn't want attention, he wanted them to live, that's all. 2 winters later, the worst blizzard in over a decade swept across the northern frontier. Rail lines froze, telegraph poles snapped, entire towns went dark. But stories came out after. Stories of people who survived in the most unlikely ways. One boy who warmed his little sister by building a box in the barn. A widow who built a full sleeping chamber for herself and her goat in a hay-wrapped corner of her cellar. A group of line workers trapped in a rail car who insulated it with sawdust and blankets and survived 6 days until help arrived. And in more than one of those stories, the same phrase appeared. They said a man in Montana once built something like this. It passed from mouth to mouth, pen to pen, fire to fire. It became a lesson, not a miracle, a method, and that made all the difference. Years later, long after the baby had grown into a girl with calloused hands and a stubborn chin like her father, long after Matthew's hair had gone grey and his joints stiff, long after the hay warmer had become a footnote in some obscure book of frontier survival, a stranger arrived on horseback. He was young, dusty, nervous. He held a folded scrap of paper, yellowed with time. "I'm looking for the man who built this," he said. Matthew took the paper, smoothed it open. There, in faded ink, was his own sketch, a diagram of the warmer, his name still scrawled at the bottom. "Where'd you get this?" he asked. "From my pa," the boy said. "He kept it in the stove drawer. Always said if things got real bad, I should build one of these. He died last spring, but I never forgot it. And now I got a little one on the way. Snow's already early this year. I came to ask how you made it." Matthew looked down at the paper, then at the boy. He smiled. "Come on in," he said. "I'll show you." And inside that cabin, older now but still strong, still warm, the two of them sat on the floor with straw in their hands and built the shape again, piece by piece, layer by layer, not because it was fancy or modern or patented, but because once, in the cold, it had saved a life. And when the wind howled outside again, it was no longer a threat, just a sound, because inside, a child would be warm, because someone had remembered, because someone had built, because when the firewood ran out, hay held on.